Barack Obama has led the tributes to civil rights icon John Lewis, saying he risked his life and his blood for his country. The veteran politician died at the age of 80 after a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. He was the youngest and the last survivor of the Big Six civil rights activists, a group that was led by Martin Luther King Jr. Well, let's speak now to Mark Thompson, a leader in the civil rights movement who knew John Lewis well. A very warm welcome to you, Mark. For so many of us, we feel as though we know John Lewis because he reached out of those clips and spoke to so many of us so purely. Yet you had the great pleasure of knowing him personally. What was he like?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and having these tributes. John was a very humble man. And I think if people go on social media and see how many people have been posting pictures with John Lewis, everyday people not necessarily as famous or well known, it's because he made himself accessible to everyone. You know, and as I speak to you in the country you're in, from the country where I am, you know, America and Britain are linked by the American Revolution. John led another revolution in America. It was a revolution for democracy, for voting rights, and it was a very important revolution. I'm able to vote today because of John Lewis. Millions of people are able to vote today because of John Lewis. We had an African American elected president of the United States because of what John Lewis did. And I think it's also important to note that as we see a lot of and I know you all have been covering this as well, and we appreciate this too, a lot of the racial turmoil that's going on in America today. The same thing was going on when John Lewis was a young man, especially in 1965. Within days apart, you had in January of 65, Dr. King and John Lewis leading a march in Selma, Alabama. On February 4th of 65, Malcolm X even came to Selma and teased the possibility of putting aside differences with Dr. King to join the civil rights movement. John Lewis was there. He helped to organize that event, and he and I used to talk about what if Malcolm X had lived. It was barely 2 weeks later that Malcolm X himself was assassinated. February 16th, 1965, another colleague of John Lewis's, another comrade who died also within the past 24 hours, Reverend C.T. Vivian, beaten at the Dallas County courthouse trying to register people to vote by Sheriff Jim Clark, the same sheriff that would bloody John Lewis on March 7th on Bloody Sunday itself. And so all of this is happening one after the other. We look at this situation here and we see the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and all of it happening at once. But that was what was going on in 1965.
And
John
Mark,
Lewis met that challenge.
John Lewis was not a man who rested on his laurels, was he? I mean, after, basically being personally involved in ending racial segregation, he went on to have a career in Congress for 3 decades. And as you say, saw a black president coming into power and being given the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honour that you can receive in the United States. An incredible legacy, and yet he continued to work tirelessly, didn't he?
He never stopped working. He always talked about getting in good trouble, and he stayed in trouble. And he inspired us all to do the same, and hopefully we will continue to do so. You know, once the bug of justice bit John Lewis, it never let him go, and he never let it go either. So many things that he did, going after gun violence, being a co-sponsor of H.R. 40, the reparations bill. He was so active in the anti-apartheid struggle as well. John Lewis never stopped. And in his memory, neither can we. We're all going to miss him. I already miss him terribly. But for those of us who share his faith, John Lewis was a minister too. We know he will never really leave us. And we can never stop either. And so I guess all we can say is to our newly crowned ancestor, what trouble shall we get in today, sir?
I mean, it was an amazing phrase that has been much repeated, but he really did get into trouble himself, didn't he? I mean, he talked about being arrested more than 40 times in the 60s and a further 5 times once he was in Congress.
Yeah, he did. And, civil disobedience was something he learned from his mentor, Dr. King, and from Reverend James Lawson during the Nashville sit-ins. I grew up in Nashville, and I grew up with the stories of that sit-in movement in Nashville. When my mother was 16 years old, she used to plot to sneak out of Pearl High School every day to join John Lewis and the students from Fisk in those sit-in movements. Her plots were not always successful, though. There was some older folk that said they didn't want her to get hurt. But I always heard about that, and it touched me from my childhood to my adulthood. And every year in Selma is the only civil rights event that is commemorated annually, every single year. That's how sacred that movement was. That's how powerful
Wonderful.
Bloody Sunday was. And John Lewis and Hosea Williams and Amelia Boynton and others and C.T. Vivian and F.D. Reese took those blows. Again, John was a minister. And so one not need be religious to know the story. We believe that Jesus shed blood for the sins of the world. John Lewis shed blood for the sins of America.
Oh, what a lovely note to finish on there, Mark Thompson. So many quotes I've been reading this afternoon. I just want to finish on this one. He was quoted as saying, when you see something that's not right, not just, not fair, you have a moral obligation to say something, to do something. Our children will ask us, what did you do? What did you say? We have a mission to be on the right side of history. And I think it's fair to say, isn't it, Mark Thompson, that we're judged on the right side of history. So good to talk to you this evening. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Isabel.